Hello, music lovers. Welcome back. It's about time we got back into some proper music nerd stuff. Chords, rhythms, grooves, scales, production, all that good stuff. Today, I'm gonna take you back to the past. Please don't sue me, AVGN. We're looking at Rhythm is Rhythm, Strings of Life. Have you ever heard of the law of infinite probability? The original concept stated if you got enough monkeys and enough typewriters, then eventually one of them would type a line of Shakespeare. Well, the EDM version of that is if you work with enough DJs and enough EDM producers, eventually one of them will ask, hey, can we make a track like Strings of Life? And I don't blame them. There's a lot to learn from this classic of 1987. So I present to you my Noteworthy for Strings of Life. Now, Derek May is widely credited as being one of the founders of Techno. Strings of Life, though, is also considered one of the earlier house tracks and considered by many to be one of the origins of rave. In other words, this track started something. Oh, by the way, big props to Oral TV for uploading the original Transmat release. Their upload is in the correct pitch, or as far as I can tell anyway, whereas the re-release from 2013 on Spotify with this Innovator record cover unfortunately appears to have been recorded at the wrong speed and therefore pitch. In other words, they've recorded a 33 vinyl at 45. Whoops. Anyway, let's dive in. Right, let's start by listing off our ingredients. It starts off with that iconic piano. We'll get into the details of each sound later. Next, we have the first of our titular strings. The first of 4 string parts. This lead is what I would call a noodle, when you're soloing over the music and just noodling around. The second string part is our main hook. Which has an upper line and a lower. And sometimes a third string line. And sometimes that lead joins too. So there are the titular Strings of Life, up to 4 parts of. Moving on, there's a pad in the break. Obviously, we have drums. Which go through many, many changes. Some very unconventional patterns too, especially by today's standards. Lots of various sound sources in there. We'll go over the details soon. But that is your total list of ingredients. Did you notice anything missing? Yes, that's right. Strings of Life has no bass part. Talk about experimental. Take note, all those trying to be original. Those attempting to change the world care not for tradition. Okay, let's look at some sounds. The piano to start with. So what we have here is my approximation of 1987 technology. Instead of using a full piano sample like we would use in current day technology, keyboards of the day had very, very little memory. We're talking kilobytes. Tiny. They certainly couldn't afford to sample separate keys at different pitches and different velocities. So what I've done is taken a single sample, just one of the middle keys from the built-in Ableton piano, stretched that across every key, made it mono, and reduced the sample rate and bit rate. to try and emulate the capabilities of the gear in that day. Now, I have since found out that the keyboard in question may have been a Kurzweil K250, which would actually be a much higher quality than this, but be it from recording limitations, or maybe it was a different piano, the one on the record is certainly quite lo-fi, and I think this is close enough, so I'm going to leave it there. The only other processing is a little bit of EQ, adding some mids and removing the bottom end. You are also hearing some processing from the master. Shock horror, I know, I don't normally use master processing, but I'm emulating an older record here, so we're doing some tape and vinyl emulation. We have the Tone Boosters Real Bus for tape emulation, and Isotope's vinyl. Both free, of course. You will also spot some corrective EQ on the bus for the strings and drums, just to match it to the record. Okay, next up, the strings. The strings of life. Now, this sound is interesting. Apparently, Derek's mother had connections with the local orchestra, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, and he managed to be able to record some strings. Not a live performance, but a sample. And I don't imagine he had much more than 1 second of sample time. Unfortunately, we don't have access to that string recording, but I hear this sample very much like the classic orchestra stab that's used in a lot of early dance recordings. The one taken from the Fairlight sampler. That sample is taken from the 4th movement of Stravinsky's Firebird Suite. So that's one of the layers I've used. I've added an octave for extra brightness. I've layered that with a string sample, which is on a very, very short loop. Again, emulating the devices of the day. With very, very little memory, they would have used very short loops to sustain sounds, whereas today we would just record the sound for longer. And I was still missing some low mids versus the record, so I added another lower orchestra sample. All three together. Not too bad. I've also added this attack macro here. I noticed on the original recording that Derek appeared to be adjusting the attack of the sound live as it was recorded. Now, Derek is definitely a proponent of live performance capture, and you can hear these lead lines are not programmed. So I believe this attack modulation is him trying to emulate a live string performance, in the way a string player might change the way they bow. So you'll hear that change up throughout the track. Now, I've also used this sound for the main hook. Almost the same sound for the lower line. I have added an extra harmonic here, but we'll discuss that when we get to the chords section. Same sound again for the 4th line. All three sound like. And for the pad in the middle, of course I've used Vital, a very simple patch based on how most synths of the day would have made pad sounds. So we have a couple of detuned saw waves on a very slow envelope, slow attack, slow release. Filter out some high frequencies, and a little bit of chorus, courtesy of Tal's free Chorus LX. I believe is a model of a Juno chorus. Even if this wasn't a Juno synth used, certainly appropriate for the era. Onto the drums. One article I read did mention Derek might have had a 909. And there certainly are some 909 sounding snares in there, like these. And these two. Very 909 vibes. However, later on, there is this fill. That's a reverse 909 snare, which the 909 couldn't do. So we have evidence of sampling, unless someone was splicing tape, which I find very unlikely. So I think we have drums from various sources here. I do vaguely recall Derek mentioning he used an EMU sampler or drum machine, which at that year would have been a drumulator or emulator, or possibly SP12, which is where I found this snare sample for the fill here. You can hear a 909 snare join that. So that's an EMU sample plus a 909 sample. By the way, I found all these samples from a pack called the Drum Club Mega Bundle. It was a name your own price sample pack full of classic machines. Look at this list. Future Ben here. It appears this bundle is no longer available. So I'm going to upload it and link it in the description. So I've taken the kick from an 808. That seemed to be the closest to the record. I think these shakers were from the EMU. Two different types. There's a bongo. I used the 808 clap for this pattern. That EMU snare fill. There's a ride cymbal in there. I couldn't get a very close match on this one, but I just used a 909. I also got these hats from a 909. In the second break section, there's this conga. I think that's an EMU sample as well. That about covers our little motley crew of drums here. Let's move on to the writing side of things. Okay, before we look at those actual strings of life, those are the lead line. And lead lines don't make sense without knowing what's underneath them. So let's look at the piano first, because there's certainly lots to talk about here. So, first of all, structure. What you would typically find these days is this section. That would normally be the turnaround, and the riff would usually start here. But what you'll find in many places is this is not the start of the riff. You can hear it when the first lead line comes in. The drops, as it were, all come in when the piano is on that section. So it's not by accident. Derek actually hears what we would normally use as a turnaround as the start. Not necessarily unusual, given that there were probably very few standards established by this point, but certainly remarkable from today's perspective. Now, if you throw aside musical tradition for a second and think like a producer, this actually makes a lot of sense because Derek has clearly heard that section as the stronger start. So why not? Now, there's a harmonic reason for that too, which I'll get to in a moment. But placing that at the start left us with one of the most iconic riffs in history. If you think about most piano house after this, they copied the second bit. So this still stands out today. So another reason this stands out from the crowd is this riff is actually multitonal. If you don't know what multitonal is, we discussed this in the deadmau5 video. Thoroughly recommended. But basically it means we are swapping between scales. So this first section is all in what's called Dorian. And from here onwards, it's in minor. Let me show you this in A, just so we can see it versus all the white notes, make it a little bit easy to look at. I'll still play it back in D sharp, so it sounds the same. But as you can see, from here onwards, it's all white keys, so this is minor. Let's break down this section of the riff a little. Let me just extend this, and I'm going to draw chord 1, like that. So you can see that here, the bulk of our riff is based on chord 1. We also have this on top. This is called a 7th, because the chord is based on 1, 3, 5, so that makes this 7. So as you can see, the rhythm comes from staggering the root note of the chord with the rest. Like that. Then we also have this variation, if you will, where we move note 5 up to note 6. Here. You could argue this makes a chord 6. Let me build chord 6 here. So you can see this makes all the notes of chord 6, just without 6 at the bottom. We call that an inversion. So this is a 6. Now this extra note that's not in chord 6, let's work out what that is. It can't be a 7th anymore. This is 1, 3, 5. That note would be the 7th of chord 6. So this is a 9th. When there is a 9th in the chord but no 7th, that's called an add 9. So this is chord 6 add 9, inverted. So to sum up, our main riff section here is swapping between chord 1 7th and chord 6 add 9, inverted. Well, that's how a muso would put it. The easy EDM version is play chord 1, change one note, keep a common tone at the top. Done. Oh, and if you're wondering about this extra upper octave note 3 that comes in every other bar, this doesn't create a new chord because it's already in the chord down here. That type of variation we call voicing. It's still this chord, just a different voicing of it. That's giving us a kind of top melody hook. And also the rhythm changes up there as well. We have this double stutter. So now, let's discuss the not turnaround. You may notice we are not entirely on the white keys anymore. What was our normal note 6 has now gone up 1. It's now sharp. And the sharp 6 in an otherwise minor environment is what makes Dorian. And it gives us a slight lifting feeling. I have always referred to the Dorian mode as basically minor with hope. And you can hear it happening here. It's giving a little bit of a lift. Let's do an experiment. What would this sound like in just normal minor? Imagine you were writing this as a new producer, just sticking to the scale like newcomers do, what we call diatonic harmony, when you stick inside the scale, blissfully unaware of multitonality. Here's what it would sound like if you were doing Strings of Life, all minor. Interesting. It's just not quite the same, is it? I'm not sure if that's nostalgia or familiarity, but for me, this is the one. And likewise, what would the rest of the riff sound like if you were to purely stay in Dorian instead of swapping to minor here? So if we make all the 6s sharp, so this would be a diatonic version of Dorian. This is Strings of Life in purely Dorian. Again, not quite the same vibes. Now, you could get rid of this clash here. You don't have to keep this. This could be a version. Let's relieve that clash between 6 and 7 here. Put that top note up to the 1. So these basically move together. That would sound like this. Definitely more acceptable, but different vibes again, right? So, another great example of multitonal magic. So, let's discuss this chord progression while we're here. Let's look at the bass for our clues. This is note 7, note 6, and note 4. So, our chord progression is a 7, 6, 4. And as we discussed earlier, back to 1. So, it's a 7, 6, 4 in Dorian, but the voicing is interesting because it doesn't contain the whole chord. Let's just build chord 7 normally. That would look like this. So you can see note 3 is missing. Here's what it sounds like with. Same deal for chord 6. Here, let's add the 3rd in. This one isn't missing anything. This is normal chord 4. 1, 3, and 5 at the top. We just have an extra bass note. Here's how you might voice it if you didn't want the extra bass note at the bottom. Clearly too muddy. Best to keep it with these groups of 3 up here. Lets us achieve that lifting feeling as well. As does removing the 3rd. Just kind of cleans it up a little bit. Doesn't change the mood too drastically with the 3rd in there, but it is a little less muddy. Slightly more uplifting, and great example to show you don't need every note in every chord. Chords can be implied. Or in other words, do what sounds good. Quick addendum, random thought. I was quickly pondering if the Dorian minor swap thing came from gospel, because a few house tracks did it, and just came to my mind now, the classic Marshall Jefferson's Move Your Body. Again, one of the earliest house tracks on record, 1986. Part of that piano solo intro is in Dorian. Like that section. And the main riff, minor. Just a thought. There's more piano to discuss. There are 2 other piano sections like this one. The first of what you might term breaks. This is the first piano break. Let's have a look at what's going on here. Let me show you this in A again. For those that aren't fluent in D sharp minor. There's no multitonality in this section. This is all minor. It's all based around chord 1. Arpeggios on chord 1. If you don't know what an arpeggio is, or an arp, it's just a broken up chord. So instead of playing a chord like this, you might do this. Simple as that. That's all an arp is. Hopefully you can see how this lines up. Most of this is just a broken up chord 1. Mostly all the notes from chord 1. 1, 3, and 5. There is some movement, however, and that's implied from these bottom notes. We have 1, 7. I'm going to ignore this. I'm classing this as a passing note. Basically, I'm only counting the ones at the start of the bar. So it's 1, 7, 7, 5. And because the lowest note of the chord is usually the root, this being at the bottom implies there is a chord movement. So even though the melody on top is all based around chord 1, the changing bass notes kind of form new chords and imply new chords. Back to the melody then. Everything in between we call passing notes. So notice that a lot of the notes that land on the beat are from chord 1. Those are what we call the strong beats, strong notes in a melody sense. And then you'll notice the other notes, not from chord 1, the passing notes, they go what we call in the cracks, in between, basically. So notes from chord 1 on the beat and passing notes in between. So hopefully that makes it a little clearer why I would say this melody is based around arpeggiating chord 1, and we have an implied movement underneath of 1, 7, 7, 5. Now, the second piano break, if you want to call it that, is over here. Let's look at that in A. As you can see, very similar rhythm and chord voicing to the second half of the main riff. We still have that separation of the root note and the rest of the chord. We do have an extra bass note though now. That's just holding on note 1. We also have an extra note 1 up top here as well as a new common tone. But the main difference between this and the other riff is this entire section is Dorian. Remember how I showed you what the riff would sound like in purely Dorian? By doing this. It's basically that, but instead of keeping the note 3, this moves up to note 4, so we're basically swapping between chord 1 and chord 4 now. Well, an inversion of chord 4, because note 1 is still at the bottom. So it's just like the main riff, but in entirely Dorian, but we have this extra common tone, and we have a melody swap, which is basically just this note 3 up here moved up the octave. And the second half is basically just a shortening of the notes. A good lesson in the power of note lengths there. Obviously, this is played in live, my best attempt to mimic the original. Just listen to the difference that makes between the long section obviously the drums do swap up as well. Nice little way to change up the feel there, just by changing the note lengths. So that's the piano. Let's have a look at the strings of life. Right, onto that iconic string line. I knew I was going to say iconic a lot in this video. Sorry. So now we know the chords underneath. Let's look at what's going on musically with the melody. I've got it in A over here. So we're starting on note 2, 3, 2, 2, 7, 4, 1. So how can we explain that? Well, first of all, I would say this is definitely the kind of melody written from feeling as opposed to trying to strictly adhere to the chords underneath. Obviously, we know the chords under this are changing. We have that 7, 6, 4 in Dorian into mostly over the 1 in minor, but the melody remains the same. And part of the reason this works is you'll notice this melody has no note 6 in it, which would tie it to one of those two scales. So without note 6, this can work over both Dorian and minor. But let's build chord 1. Not the best sound to demonstrate chords on. I might move to piano in a minute. But if we look at these melody notes, note 2 is basically the 9th of chord 1. Note 3 is already in the chord. And this is 7. Obviously the 7th of chord 1. Let's demonstrate this on piano. So, what's actually happening here, if you take these as the main notes of the melody, these are the notes from chord 7. Let me build chord 7 to show you. 7, 2, and 4. So we're effectively jamming chord 7 over chord 1. which is a very dance thing to do. The melody does resolve to note 1 at the end, though. So we spend most of the time on these extended notes, if you will, but we do resolve back to the 1. And that does help with its ability to loop, because a little bit of resolution is good. Most of the time it's floating, but it does come back down. Like I said, very much a melody line written on feeling, not looking at the notes too hard. And all that really helps with its strength as a hook. When you have a repeated phrase like this, we call it an ostinato. And ostinatos are the best way to drill a melody into people's heads, because it's just on repeat, repeat, repeat. If this line kept changing to accommodate the chords underneath, then sure, from a musician's perspective, it's more sophisticated, but it's a lot less memorable. And from the perspective on the dance floor, it's a lot less entrancing too. So that's the main line, and underneath that, there is a supporting part, acting like an accent. Now, I did briefly mention in the tone section earlier about an extra harmonic, and that's this one. Because in the original, I can hear some extra notes going on. I think when Derek sampled the strings, he sampled not just pure notes or octaves. There might have been a chord or a partial chord in there, because I can hear a major third up from the note played, which is this note. It could be a note, could just be a harmonic, I'm not sure. It's certainly a lot more prominent in the original. I've kind of decluttered my version here. Here's mine. Here is the original. So what's causing a lot of the clutter there is this extra harmonic or note. It might be in all the string samples, but it's certainly in this support part. And it's creating a rather unfortunate note, because the support note is note 5. Let me show you on the MIDI. So it's basically this, accenting these notes. But the rogue harmonic is a major third up, which is this note, which is a sharp 7. Now, neither Dorian or minor have sharp 7 in there. It's a normal 7. So we have this rather unfortunate clash. It's all rather crunchy, because if I draw in the MIDI for the main piano chord, the chord 1/7, the string sample then adds a little bit of this in there. So that's where some of that chaos is coming from. I'm sorry if I've just spoiled Strings of Life for you. It might be one of those things that you can't unhear once I've pointed it out. But now you know, if anything sounded off in the original to you, it's probably that. There was a 2005 re-release with a vocal on, which removed it. And I know Derek May doesn't like that version, but I think that's for other reasons than the change of sounds. And anytime it's been orchestrated live, that note isn't in there. So I think it's an unfortunate byproduct of the early sampling limitations, but also part of the charm, right? Now, looking at the rest of the melody lines, specifically the live played lead things. Now, for those of you who don't know how to play leads in D sharp minor, here's a great tip. Just use all the black notes. All of these lead lines use just the black notes, and there's a reason that works. It's because it's a very useful type of scale called a pentatonic. Minor pentatonic in our case. Penta meaning 5, and basically you can think of it like the best 5 notes out of the 7 in a scale. For those curious, it's notes 1, 3, 4, 5, and 7. In other words, leaving out 2 and 6. It's common to find most strong melodies are made from pentatonic scales. So you can't go far wrong. If you're in D sharp, use all the black notes. As you can see, it's the case for literally all of these extra melodies. all the lines like that. All pentatonic. And that also goes for the extra addition, that fourth string line in the extra chaotic section. Let's talk about the pad for a brief moment. So if you remember, the second break is entirely in Dorian. The pad is holding notes 4 and 1 and occasionally swapping to notes 4 and 7. The piano underneath is swapping between chords 1 and 4. Only the chord 4 has the note 4 in there. So holding this 4 would normally be considered a bit of a strange choice, but because it's so high up, it's in a much higher octave than the piano, this part is just really serving as atmosphere. And you could argue that holding that note 4, which isn't one of the notes in chord 1, acts as a kind of tension, which you can then release to get back into the familiar drop. Okay, on to drums. Now, if there's an argument to be made for the techno origins of this track, it's because of the drums. The reason I say that is because most of the track does not rely on a backbeat. You hear that? We don't have anything on the 2 and the 4. Where the clap would normally be used for that, instead here it's used more like a percussion part, which is very techno. Or should I say what became techno, based on Derek's influence. Now there is a backbeat here, but it's used as a fill. And then it drops. We do have a regular backbeat in the chilled out break section. Even then, in the middle of that, we get. So the fact that the backbeat is in this break section, which is definitely the most houseiest part of the track, shows to me that it's not part of the core groove, instead serving as a break to that kick-led groove from the rest of the track, which is what became more common in techno. As I said at the beginning, you can see the origins of techno, house, and rave forming in this track. Speaking of that kick-led groove, the core kit is made up of kick, a couple of shakers, and this bongo. Lots of various interspersed snare fills. And may I draw your attention to the fact that they are not just rolling on every 16th note. There's a bit of a pattern to them. Always nice to see. I wish more would do that today. And we have sometimes this clap pickup. Like I said earlier, more like a percussion roll. We have the occasional ride cymbal on this pattern. Most people would normally throw the rides or hi-hats on the offbeats like this. But instead here we've got more of a live drummer feel, more of a Latin thing maybe. Here's some more fills, different patterns again. Then we have the addition of the conga in the break. That's the housey bit. Ah, yes, and on this first piano break, you can see the drums MIDI running through, but I've automated the drum fader. At this point in the track, you can clearly hear Derek is operating the fader for the drums, just as he would on the DJ mixer, highlighting the accents instead of programming a start-stop. Now the backbeat does join for the last drop, which is still a common trait today, where we throw everything in from before. Now, worth bearing in mind, this is a 7-8 minute mix. You seldom see those these days, except on underground gigs. So in today's attention deficit economy, I'm not sure how far this kind of arrangement would carry you today, but what we do take away from this, with all these glorious change-ups in rhythm and harmony, not forgetting the technology limitations at the time, what we take away from this is, if you want to change the world, you can't be sounding like what came before. Okie dokie, I'm going to leave it there. As usual, I hope we all learned something. I know I did. If you did, you know what to do. Help us out in whichever way you deem appropriate. And until next week, I'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye.